Now, whilst I was in my jungle, one of the extraordinary things that happened was the return of David Cameron. Yes, he was sort of elevated to Lord Cameron, and he is now the Foreign Secretary. And I look today, Jimmy Lai, the former boss of the Hong Kong Apple Daily, is in court. He's facing sedition charges. It could lead to life imprisonment. And the Foreign Secretary says that the whole thing is politically motivated. Well, that's all well and good, but that's the Foreign Secretary who was PM, talked about the golden era of our relationships with China. And I worry when he speaks about Israel and Gaza, not capable of making an independent foreign policy position clear from the British government. No, doing it conjoined with the German foreign minister, and a joint article so clumsily worded that it even suggested that at some point the Israelis had actually targeted civilians. But then I guess it was probably drafted in German in the first place. Yes, this the David Cameron who was obsessed with bombing Libya, getting rid of Colonel Gaddafi, leading to the mass migrations across the Mediterranean, and indeed the birth of ISIS. Not to mention the Greenshill scandal and much else. Well, I'm joined by somebody who might take a more moderate view than that. I'm joined by Sir Mark Lyall Grant, former UK security advisor and British permanent representative to the UN in David Cameron's time. Now, you know, what I'm saying, Sir Mark, is that on some very major foreign policy areas, and I'm really focusing particularly on China and indeed on Libya, that David Cameron got things, as we would now see it, very badly wrong.
I think his appointment as Foreign Secretary is actually quite an inspired choice, Nigel, because he has a huge amount of experience. He can hit the ground running. He knows all the world leaders already. And so in a relatively short period that he might have as Foreign Secretary before the next election, he can actually make an impact. So I think he's got a lot of credibility within the Foreign Office. They're delighted to have a big beast, as it were, as the head of the department. But he will fight for British interests overseas. He has a lot of credibility in terms of experience, in terms of his development assistance, in terms of climate change. So I would argue that he could be a very good Foreign Secretary for this period.
He's got a lot of big calls wrong, though, hasn't he?
Well,
Libya, come on, let's face it. We got rid of Gaddafi. Look what it's led to.
No, but that was a good decision. That saved hundreds of thousands of civilian lives in Libya. I was involved in that. I was the ambassador at the UN at the time. I got the resolution through. I was drafted by me and my team in New York, and I would defend that decision to the hilt. We had to stop Gaddafi from massacring his own civilians. Now, China, you can argue about. But again, I was involved in that decision as a national security advisor. And I can tell you, Nigel, that we did discuss the issue very carefully in the National Security Council on more than one occasion. How important was the prosperity agenda? How important the values? How important security? But the reality is that for a country like the UK needs to have an economic relationship with the second largest economy in the world. And that's the sort of balance that the government is trying to do.
But we were prepared to turn a blind eye to industrial espionage and much else.
No, we certainly didn't turn a blind eye to that. Absolutely not.
Huawei getting involved in our communications networks.
That was a decision that was very carefully thought through. It changed for a number of different reasons because the Chinese government approach changed. It changed and toughened on Hong Kong. It changed and toughened with the National Security Act, which meant that countries like Huawei would have to report to the intelligence agencies. So a lot of things changed and the policy changed accordingly.
On the bigger picture, and never say, GBNews audience, you don't hear both sides of the argument here because you do. It seems that international support for Israel is waning very, very quickly.
I think that is true. Not quickly, but it is waning. And we've seen that over the last few weeks. The language by the traditional allies of Israel, if you like, which is the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom and Germany, the language has shifted. And the Americans in particular are taking a much tougher line, both in private, but also now in public. Because I think the extent of the civilian casualties in Gaza has surprised and taken aback Israel's closest allies. And the way they're conducting this operation, the international community is concerned that is storing up problems for the future in terms of radicalizing the Palestinian youth. And probably the biggest issue, which isn't much discussed in the news, is the stopping of BP and almost all the top shipping container companies passing through the Red Sea because of the Houthis.
Yeah.
Now, that is going to add to our oil costs, it's going to add to our commodities costs, and directly affect the British economy.
I think there are some international shipping problems beyond even that, and I'm with you. I'm quite worried about that. But when Ben Wallace, our really quite well-respected former Defence Secretary, talks about Israeli killing rage this morning, this is quite aggressive language being used, isn't it?
That isn't language that the government is using.
No, but I was surprised that Ben Wallace used it.
Yes, I think that is slightly inflammatory language. Clearly, Israel has a right to self-defense. It's had that since the atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. But the danger right from the start, Nigel, was that the way they conducted the operation would make the situation in the longer term worse, both for the region and more globally. And I fear that we're reaching a sort of tipping point now where even Israel's closest allies cannot see the sort of devastation being wrought in Gaza go on day after day.
Difficult situation that Netanyahu finds himself in.
Very
because if
difficult
Hamas aren't eliminated, they'll come back and do it all again.
Indeed, and he hasn't achieved the publicly set out military objectives he put there. He hasn't killed the 3 Hamas leaders in Gaza. He hasn't freed all the hostages. He hasn't destroyed Hamas's military capability, let alone its political organization. So from his point of view, he wants to keep going. He feels he has to keep going.
Yeah.
But if America says enough is enough and they allow through a UN Security Council resolution demanding a ceasefire tonight, then I think they're going to have to think again.
Difficult call, Mark. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.